And the plan is this morning is to get from Hosea chapter 7 to the end of Hosea chapter 10. And then Wednesday night we'll do 11, 12, 13, and 14. Before we get started in the class, I'm going to ask Don if he would to lead us in a word of prayer.
Our Father in heaven, we just come before thy throne with grace and mercy this morning. We pray you be with us. We enter into our Bible study that we can concentrate on what we're learning, the fact our lives will be better fitted for thy teaching those around about us your word. Help us get in an open heart and mind to be able to better prepare ourselves for that home of faith. Make sure you go with us, protect us, and guide us all of our lives, and help us to be able to have that home of faith in heaven. We approach the end of our lifetime. But you just for our sins, we come repenting of them. For this prayer we ask in your Son's holy name. Amen.
Amen. I'm going to have to ask you to excuse me this morning. I can sympathize with Ryan, okay? I'm going to be teaching the class with a cough drop tucked in my cheek. So hopefully it won't be too distracting, and I won't have a coughing spell or anything. I think my allergies are really acting up on me this past week. I don't feel bad, just all this stuff is going on in your head sometimes. I want to mention something here. Saw Cindy having a conversation with me probably ahead of time. But she makes a very good point. The things we're reading about, the things we're studying about here in the Old Testament, especially through these prophets, these things are there for us to learn lessons from. Okay? It's not there for us to sit back and look out in the world and say, yep, look how wicked and evil all those people are out there. They're for us to look at and then look in the mirror and make sure that I'm not doing some of the very same things these people were doing in the Old Testament. The Apostle Paul over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he says that those Old Testament examples, those Old Testament things that were written down were examples for us. There in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1, it says, "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all of our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food." Hey, this was these 10 northern tribes that we've been talking about the last few weeks. They were part of that. They had all been baptized into Moses. He goes on to verse 8, says, verse 5, that God wasn't pleased with most of them. He was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Verse 6, now these things became our examples. These things are our examples to the intent in verse 6 that we shouldn't lust after evil things like they lusted, or become idolaters like they were, or commit sexual immorality as some of them did, or tempt Christ as some of them also did, or complain. There in verse 10, as some of them complained. And then again in verse 11, all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. It's really easy to look out and see how wicked everybody else is and make that application to everybody else. But we need to be looking in the mirror and doing that self-examination to make sure that we, as the children of God, as the people of God, don't follow that same path that the children of God and the people of God in the Old Testament did. So we want to be careful about that. Any comments on that before we move on? I always want to try to make that personal application of these things when we can. Well, we are in the book of Hosea. We're going to be starting in chapter 7 this morning. And what I've decided to do, because we've got so much to cover, I'm just going to pick out a few key verses. And we're going to make a few applications from a few key verses in each chapter. So I picked out some verses. I'm going to put them in the overhead. Not overhead projector. Showing my age there. I'll put them on the TV screens. And we'll make some comments on them and open those up for some discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to get through chapter 10 this morning. But just to kind of summarize where we're at, Hosea was a prophet of God. He was prophesying around 755 BC, which would have been around 25 years or so before the Israelites were going to go away into, the 10 northern tribes were going to go away into Assyrian captivity to never return. It seems that captivity is set in stone, that that's actually going to happen. That there's not going to be anything they can do to avoid that, but they are called on to repent so that God would show mercy to that remnant, to the ones who actually wanted to obey God. They were going to be scattered. They're going to be scattered all around the world. But God looks at them and He sees them as a wife who was committing harlotry. He said, "You're my wife, Israel, and now you've committed harlotry by your worshiping of these idols." So he tells Hosea to go and take a wife of harlotry, to go marry a wife who is a prostitute. And that's what he does. And she bears him 3 children. And God names all 3 of these children. The first one was Jezreel, which means God scatters. And that was a son. Lo Ruhamah, which means no mercy. That was his daughter, the second born. And Lo Ami, which means not my people. And this was all representative of how God felt about those 10 northern tribes at this time. He was going to scatter them. He was not going to show them any mercy. And they were no longer his people. We see that Gomer, in the first couple chapters, she persists in her prostitution until the point that she actually becomes enslaved in this, and Hosea has to go and buy her back. He has to go buy her back, and what we come up with was probably the equivalent of a slave for 30 pieces of silver, basically. So it's a really sad situation to see going on in the life of Hosea, but this is how God felt that Israel was treating him. Now, this theme of harlotry with Israel and these idols is mentioned over and over and over again as we go through the book of Hosea. God is just hammering home that this is what you've done. This is what you are being. Israel sins, and the impending judgment is hammered home over and over and over again. It seems very repetitive. Sometimes God condemning them for their sins. And it seems like the same sins over and over again, but maybe from different angles. And that God's judgment is coming. And God is driving that point home. The reason we repeat things is because we'll make sure people understand it, right? I'm sure none of you have ever had to repeat anything to your children. You know, sometimes on the front end, you want to repeat it before they get a chance to forget it. You know, hey, did you understand what I said? This is what I need. This is what I want you to do. So we repeat things. That's what God is doing here. But we see even in all of this, God still had a willingness to forgive. God wanted to forgive them. But they just never would return to Him other than in maybe some superficial ways. They never really turned back to Him with His heart. And the point is made by God that this was the way that you were even since you came up out of Egypt. All right, any comments before we move on to chapter 7 from anybody? All right. Well, chapter 7 and verse 1. Chapter 7 verse 1 says, "When I would have healed Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim was uncovered, and the wickedness of Samaria. For they committed fraud, a thief comes in, a band of robbers takes spoil outside." We mentioned that God had wanted to heal them. He wanted to forgive them. He wanted to restore them. But every time it seemed like He got close, then they would go right back to those old sins. Their sins would be laid open. Their sins were uncovered, and the wickedness in Samaria. So they just never really completely turned back to God. They made some of these superficial attempts, but they never really turned back to Him. Things had gotten so bad. They were dealing fraudulently or deceitfully with one another, and things had gotten so bad that the people were not safe inside their house or outside. He says there, a thief comes in. In other words, a thief breaks into the house. A band of robbers takes the spoils that are outside. You weren't safe anywhere. That's how bad and how wicked this nation had become. We can kind of relate to that sometimes, can't we? There's places in this country where you're not safe in or out of your house because wickedness has taken over. And we see in verse 2, it says, they do not consider in their hearts that I will remember all their wickedness. Now their own deeds have surrounded them. They are before my face. They've never really given any thought that God's going to remember what they're doing and that God is going to punish these things. God is not going to forget. God's going to remember the sins that they were committing. And modern day application, God remembers ours unless they're forgiven. Unless we repent and those sins are forgiven, God is going to remember them. Don't think He's going to forget some of these things that we have done. We need to approach Him and get repentant, get forgiveness of these things from Him so that He will remember them no more. And then we see this idea that their deeds, talking about these sins, they've surrounded them, they are before my face. The idea, I think, is that when God says, when I look at you, all I can see is your sins. All I see is your wickedness. Any comments over verses 1 and 2 of chapter 7? Okay. Verse 3. They make a king glad with their wickedness and princes with their lies. Now, who were the kings and princes? Who were they supposed to be? What was their job? The leaders of the people, weren't they? They were supposed to be the leaders of the people. When you think about it, in Judah, when there were great reformations going back to worshiping God like they were supposed to be, who was that always led by? Seemingly. The kings. The kings led it. Well, these kings in Israel certainly weren't doing that. You know, instead of being leaders and taking the people away from these sins, they were wholeheartedly participating in this sins with them. They were glad about these sins. They weren't restraining them. He goes on in verses 4 through 7. And Hosea begins to compare the people to, the way I understand this, is just an oven that's been left unattended by a baker. It's been left unattended until it rages out of control. And the application is that these princes there in Israel, they were so inflamed with wine that they begin to plot to kill their kings. They get to drinking and having a good time, and they become enraged, and they begin to plot to kill their kings. There in verse 7 it says, they are all hot like an oven, and have devoured their judges. All their kings have fallen. None among them calls upon me. If you think about that, 4 of the last 6 kings were assassinated. 4 of the last 6 kings that Israel had were assassinated. So this was being played out in real life. These people were literally, these princes and others were literally killing their kings and devouring or killing many of their judges as well. Any comments on verse 7 or down through verse 7? Y'all don't all speak up at once. Verse 8. Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Ephraim is a cake unturned. When I hear that phrase that Ephraim is a cake unturned, I remember when I was a child, my grandmother used to make pancakes. I love pancakes. Love my granny's pancakes. But she would pour that batter in there in the pan. But if you didn't flip that thing over, you were going to have a mess. You were going to have a cake that was burned on the bottom, which nobody wants, and raw on the top, which nobody wants. It's going to be good for nothing. Once it's burned on the bottom, flipping it over is not going to help anyway. So they were something that was no good. They were trying to basically have it both ways. They had burned themselves on the bottom with their idolatry. Okay? They had so sold themselves into idolatry and the worship of these idols that they were like that cake that was burned on the bottom. But they had neglected the top and he tried to cook it, and that was God's side of it. they were wanting to worship idols and then claim to worship God with their lip service. And what they wound up being was something that was good for nothing. Absolutely good for nothing. He also mentions there that they had mixed themselves among the peoples. The idea, I think, that's being presented there is that they were not turning to God for help, but they were turning to the other nations for their help and their support. God should have been the one that they should have turned to, but they just weren't willing to do that. And without a doubt, they began to turn to them and mix with them in marriages and things of this nature as well as mixing with them in their idolatrous worship. Any comments down through verse 8? All right, verses 11 through 12. He says, Ephraim also is like a silly dove. Without sense, they call to Egypt. They go to Assyria. Wherever they go, I will spread my net on them. I will bring them down like birds of the air. I will chastise them according to what the congregation has heard. He calls it just like a silly bird, just like a silly dove. Mike, you got a comment?
We've got a pair of doves. They come down and sit on top of our bird feeders, and they'll sit there for 15 minutes, and that's not an exaggeration, acting like they're trying to figure out how to get into the bird feeder. They are the stupidest birds that God ever created, and it's by His grace alone that they still exist.
How do you feel about it?
Well, that's kind of how Israel was. They're like those silly doves, aren't they? And God tells them, so look, you can turn to Egypt, you can turn to Assyria, you can take off to one of those countries, whatever you want to do, but you're not going to escape my judgment. You're not going to be able to escape judgment. Wherever you go, God says, I'm going to throw my net on you. And same thing with us. When we see this judgment that's being brought on these people of God, these people who were supposed to be the people of God, there's always kind of a symbolism there of that final judgment that all of us are going to have to face one day. And there's not going to be any escape from that either. We're all going to have to stand before God one day. And just like God was not going to allow any of them escape, there's not going to be anybody escape that final judgment. He says there at the end of verse 12, according to what, he's going to chastise them according to what their congregation has heard. Any ideas on what that might be? Think back to when they were still in the wilderness, before they had come into the land of Canaan, over in Deuteronomy chapter 28. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, Moses is here giving them instructions on what to do once they get into the land. He's telling them before they go into the land about, you go into Mount Ebal and to Mount Gerizim and you pronounce curses and blessings. Half of you on one mountain, half of you on the other. And that's the context here. He's telling them once you get into the land, you do that. But you get down to verse 63. And he says, and it shall be that, and he's addressing the whole congregation, that just as the Lord rejoiced over you to do good and multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and bring you to nothing, and you shall be plucked from off the land which you go to possess. Then the Lord will scatter you among the nations, from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone. If you look back through chapter 28 there in Deuteronomy, you'll see all these curses that God was going to bring on them. And we see that reflected in many of the things that happened to the 10 northern tribes. There was locusts, there was famine, there was drought, there was the scorching winds, all of these things God brought on them. He told them He's going to bring sieges on them. Probably one of the worst sieges that ever took place was there at Samaria. So all of these things took place just like God said they would. And here we have the people they're still not getting it. They're still not getting it after God had done all of this to try and bring them back to Him. Any comments over any of that from anybody? All right, verses 13 and verse 15. He says, though I redeemed them yet they have spoken lies against him. Though I discipline, I think the idea there is not discipline like trying to beat somebody in line, but the idea of training. Though I trained and strengthened their arms, yet they devised evil against me. The idea is, God says, I've done good for you. I have been good to you, but you return that good with evil. Verse 16, they return, but not to the Most High. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword for the cursings of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. When these punishments come on them, they didn't turn back to God. Who did they turn to?
Their idols.
Turned back to their idols, didn't they? Yeah, and probably in particular those golden calves which were there at Dan and at Bethel. And probably similar versions of that scattered throughout all the land. They would turn back to those things. And God says, you're like a treacherous bow, or a deceitful bow. And the picture in my mind is, you pull that bow back to let the arrow fly. Which way is it supposed to go? Which way does it go? It comes back on them. It does not do what it was intended to do. As a matter of fact, it's intended to do harm out there, but it actually destroys them. They're like that treacherous bow. They turn back to these idols, and in actuality, rather than helping themselves, they're going to destroy themselves. And then we see that Egypt, who they were going to ask for help, if they had not already, was just going to laugh at them. They're going to see what happens to them, and Egypt's just going to laugh. They're going to be a derision to them. Any ideas or comments over verses 13 through 16?
I think it just sums up the whole chapter, just how far they've gone. And you think of all the judges and the cycle of sin and crying, and they're still doing that, but they've forgotten who they're supposed to cry to. I mean, it says in 14, they're wailing, they're upset, but they've forgotten God completely. Like, it's not even as in the time of the judges where they forgot him, got punished, and came back. But
right. They weren't willing to listen to the prophets, and were not willing to come back when God brought punishment on them. The thing is, it seems pretty amazing to us, but the impression I get through this is they think they're okay. They think they're okay even in the eyes of God. Because we're going to see before too long, they're going to say, hey, God, we're your people. We're your people. But God's already told them through the child that was born that you are not my people.
actually makes me think of Ecclesiastes, and when it says, like, enjoy your youth, but remember, I'll call into judgment everything. Like, yeah, we've given you all these things, God has blessed you, but don't forget.
Exactly.
It's kind of like today's denominationalism. They think their worship is fine to God, just like these people worshiping, but it wasn't what God wanted.
Well, they had convinced themselves that they could worship God however they wanted to. And people, even today, and I'm afraid this is creeping into the church somewhat, are convinced that they can worship God how they please, rather than worshiping God the way that He has instructed us. All right, let's go on over to chapter 8. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, it says, set the trumpet to your mouth. He shall come like an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. Israel will cry to me, my God, we know you. Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue you. When these things begin to take place, this eagle that's going to come against the house of the Lord, I don't think it's talking about the temple. I think it's talking about the people of the Lord, the house of Israel. When these things begin to take place and this punishment gets poured out by the Assyrian army, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, God, we know you. We're your people. They think they're going to be able to, in the blink of an eye, turn back to God, think that they're going to be okay with God, and He's going to forgive them. And He's going to stop this judgment. But He says there in verse 3, you've rejected the good. You've absolutely rejected what is good. And because of that, the enemy is going to pursue you. He's going to pursue these 10 northern tribes until they are scattered all over the world. But they have the warning there. He said, blow the warning because it is coming. Any comments over verses 1 through 3? Verse 5, chapter 8. He says, your calf is rejected, O Samaria. My anger is aroused against them. How long until they attain to innocence? That calf, we think about those golden calves there at Dan and Bethel. When we hear Ephraim and we hear Samaria, I think these are terms in general used for the whole of the 10 northern tribes. There are some who make a distinction between Ephraim as being the people and Samaria being the ruling class, but I think for our purposes, this is talking about the whole of the 10 northern tribes. And he says, you 10 northern tribes, your calf is rejected. That calf, that golden calf there at Dan, the one at Bethel, it's been rejected. This is not acceptable to me. And this idea of how long until you attain innocence, I think is the idea of some of the commentators. It's not necessarily how long it's going to be before you become innocent, but how long are you going to claim to be innocent? In spite of everything you've done, in spite of all your wickedness, how long are you going to claim to be innocent? Any comments down through verse 5?
I think verse 2, going back there, when it says, they said, my God, we know you. I think we have to think about knowing God isn't enough. I mean, you know about God. Satan knows about God. We can't say, well, we know God.
Knowing who he is.
Yeah.
There's a difference between knowing who God is
Right.
and knowing God from the standpoint that we are doing what he wants us to do. Any other comments? All right, then in verse 7, he says, they sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no bud, it shall never produce meal. If it should produce, aliens would swallow it up. This is kind of a pretty graphic picture to me. I see that sower out there, and he's got his seed bag, but it's empty. And he's just reaching in there and just throwing out nothing. He's just sowing wind. And that's what their worship was like with these idols. That's what their wickedness was like. It was just nothingness. It was vanity. It was not going to do any good. When the sower goes out to sow, he wants to reap something back good. But he says, you're sowing wickedness. You're sowing evil. So when you sow this wind, this vanity, then guess what you're going to reap? He said, you're going to reap the whirlwind. You're going to reap the tornado of God's wrath. You're going to reap destruction is what's coming on you. Any comments over verse 7? He said, even if you did bring something, if something did come up, somebody else is going to eat it. You're not going to get anything out of this. Verses 12 and 13. I have written for him the great things of my law, but they were considered a strange thing. For the sacrifices of my offerings, they sacrifice flesh and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. Let's think about that. God had chosen Israel out of all the nations of the earth to give them his law. And he says it was a great law. He says, I have given him the great things of my law, but they considered it a strange thing. They didn't know it. It was strange to them. They had forgotten a lot of God's law and had really no intentions or no inclination to discover those things, to go find out what those things said. They had absolutely forgotten it. Now, they were making some pretense. He said, you're offering offerings. You're making sacrifices to me, but I don't accept them. And the idea is, behind these sacrifices, you're really not making it meat. You're just making it so you got something to eat. Now, let's go offer sacrifice, and we'll have a big meal later, and we'll have a good time. Your heart is not in this. The Lord doesn't accept them. Now, he says, I'm gonna remember your sin. I'm not gonna forget these things. And you shall return to Egypt. I don't think he meant there that they were literally gonna go back into Egypt, but he's talking about slavery there. You're gonna go back into bondage like you were in Egypt, but that bondage was gonna be with the Assyrians. Mike, do you have a comment?
Yeah, verse 12, back in Deuteronomy 4, and verse 6, God, or Moses speaking, says, think about how special a people you are, that the God who created everything gave you his law to set you apart from all the other people. I mean, they were not following the law, but they weren't even thinking about how special his law being given to them made them. I mean, it's a complete aberration of what they should have been if they would have just followed them.
Right.
And we can follow it at the same time.
Exactly. You know, here we are as Christians today, and we have greater things given to us than we find in the law of Moses, and we can forget those things, folks. We can turn our back on those things, and we can go against those things, and we can do it a little bit at a time until we don't even realize we've done it. That's the reason it's so important that we keep looking in that mirror and looking at the pattern and making sure we're matching up with what God wants us to be. It happened to them. It can happen to us if we allow it. Any other comments or questions?
So, you know, at the very beginning of the class, you talked about self-reflection, right? And I think about unintended consequences when I read Hosea, when I'm looking through, and I think about Israel, right? And you can't help but look at Israel and think of the United States. At least I can. To look at Israel and look at the United States and where we've gone, where we started, where we came from, where we're headed, right? And are we learning? Are we learning from Israel? And one of the biggest failures is, at least in my humble opinion, is that everything is in our face. What is right here is what is important. And we don't think of the consequences of our actions, and Israel did not. And they didn't teach their children. They didn't teach from generation to generation. And so when that generation failed and they made the idols and they started, and they got further and further from God, and then God had to always bring them back, you're not thinking of your children, your grandchildren. You're not thinking of the generations to come and how you have to set the standards, how you have to teach, how you have to do, and how you have to hold accountable, right? It starts with you, but it can't end with you. It's got to be those that follow you. And I think that's where you see nations fall, right? And you see Israel fail. They failed because they failed to teach, and they failed to continue doing that generation to generation, teaching God, loving God, keeping his commandments. And you know, the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is huge when it talks about, like Deuteronomy 11:19, you shall teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Deuteronomy 4:9, only take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life, and teach them to your children and your grandchildren. Isaiah 54:13, all your children shall be taught by the Lord, and great shall be the peace of your children. Of course, Proverbs 22:6, we all know, right? Train up a child the way he should go, when he is old, he will not depart from it. Deuteronomy 6:7, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. It's continuous. It doesn't stop. And you have to teach God, and you have to teach the next generations. And the biggest failure of Israel, besides falling away, right, besides doing what was wrong, they didn't think of the unintended consequences to their children and their grandchildren and not following God and what that meant and how far away they got, and God had to try to bring them back. And even though God is a great God with a ton of compassion and mercy, there is a point, right? And Israel reached it. And so But when I'm reading Hosea, when I'm going through this, those are, when I'm thinking self-analysis, right? I'm sitting there and I'm thinking of all the idols I've put in my life before God, as we do it today. Whether that be TV, sports, money, whatever it is, right? Those are our idols. And how is that reflecting upon, and maybe it's a season of life that I'm in, but how is that reflecting upon my children and my grandchildren, right? And am I learning from Israel? And I think that the United States as a whole, that you can see us following that same path that Israel took. And we are, quote unquote, the remnant, right? Christians today have to be the remnant that correct that and change that, and we have to teach. And that's the biggest lesson that Israel teaches me, right? I don't know if that's what you wanted, but I went there.
Good point.
It was on my heart. So.
Good point. Dan?
Something Mike said made me think of 1 Peter 2, because he was saying about if Israel would just pause and thought about the fact that God made, that they were the covenant people. I think about what we've been given, and he said we can fall into the same trap. 1 Peter 2 and 9 says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation." That sounds a lot like covenant language, right? And it actually quotes Hosea 1. It says that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you were once not my people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Straight out of Hosea.
Yep. Yeah. Good point. Anything else? Cindy?
Another word I'm thinking of is entitlement. That's what Israel thought they were entitled because they were God's chosen people. And the U.S. are entitled, wow, become the greatest thing, and so we deserve everything. And, in prosperity, the next generation feels entitled to that same prosperity that the older generation had. And that's not necessarily the case.
Yep. Prosperity has almost always throughout history led to the downfall. It's led nations and people into great wickedness on many occasions. You can see that through Israel. That's what's going on with Israel this time. They're in a period of prosperity. I think everything's going good. God must be happy with us. All right, anything else?
When they get feeling that way, they're going down.
We're in a bad position, are we? All right then. Verse 14 of Hosea chapter 8 says, Israel has forgotten his maker and has built temples, and I think a better translation of that is probably palaces. I think some of the more modern translations translate that palaces. Judah also has multiplied fortified cities, but I will send a fire upon his cities and shall devour his palaces. So we see Israel's forgotten his maker. They've forgotten how to serve God. Not that they didn't know who God was, but they've just forgotten about serving him the way he wanted to be served. They're trying to serve God the way they want to serve him, which is never a good idea. It has never worked when men have tried to do that. All the way back to Cain, serve God the way I want to, the way I think is best. But instead of serving him according to his law, they were using their own ideas. Now they've built these palaces. Things are going good. But that is no indication that judgment is not coming. He says even in Judah here, okay, that Judah's built fortified cities. Things are going good in Judah during the days of Uzziah. Things were going pretty good. But he says even those palaces, even Judah is going to suffer this punishment. Anything before we wrap up chapter 8? Okay, let's move on into chapter 9 here. Verses 1 through 3 says, Do not rejoice, O Israel, like the other peoples, for you have played the harlot. There's that word again. There's that accusation against Israel. You played the harlot against your God. You have made love for hire on every threshing floor. The threshing floor and winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail in her. They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt and shall eat unclean things in Assyria. He accuses them of this harlotry, which was directly tied to the idol worship. The idol worship was the harlotry. Okay, it was a spiritual prostitution that they were involving themselves in. But also along with the idol worship went literal prostitution. They had ritual prostitutes. And he says, you've committed harlotry on every threshing floor. Now, it's my understanding that threshing floors were usually built on mountaintops because you get the good breeze up there, they throw stuff in and blow the chaff out. So we're in these high places, which sounds a lot like what? Where they would normally build their altars and their idols in the high places. We've heard that phrase a lot. So even in these high places where they should be praising God for the food that they're receiving, they are committing this harlotry or this prostitution with these idols. And the conclusion is there in verse 3, you're not going to dwell in the Lord's land. You've gotten so bad that God is going to kick you out. Again, you're going to return to Egypt, that idea of bondage, and you shall eat unclean things in Assyria. So Assyria is going to be the one that comes and takes them out of the land. Some of them would go into Assyria. They were going to be scattered all over the world, and some of them may have even been scattered into Egypt. But I think when we talk about Egypt there, we're talking about bondage. Skip on ahead to verses 7 through 9. The days of punishment have come. Eric mentioned a while ago, sometimes it's too late. God's patience does run out. His long suffering has run out with them. The days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel knows the prophet is a fool. He's talking about the false prophet here. The spiritual man is insane. Hosea is calling their prophets and their spiritual men a bunch of fools and madmen, is what he's doing, because of the greatness of your iniquity and great enmity. He said, they're fools, they're madmen, because they're ignoring your great sins. They're ignoring the great hatred that you even have for one another, the hatred that actually you're showing from God. In verse 8, he says, the watchman of Ephraim is with my God. Well, who was Hosea's God? That was the real God, right? That was Jehovah. He says the watchman of Ephraim is with him. The one who's going to wait on him to speak, rather than speaking what people want to hear. But the prophet, talking about the false prophet here again, is a fowler's net in all his way, enmity in the house of his God. Okay, there's going to be hatred in the house of his God. And the prophet is going to do nothing but catch these people up in snares and traps that are going to destroy them eventually. He says they're deeply corrupted as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. I don't know if we remember that story of what happened in Gibeah. Remember the Levite that had traveled down to pick up his wife who had run off? He picked her up and they were headed back to Ephraim. And they decided that they weren't going to go stay in some of these Gentile cities. They weren't going to stay in Jebus because that's where Jebusites were. They wanted to stay in a city that was run by God's people. So they went into Gibeah, which was in the country of, or in the tribe of Benjamin. And man, those people would be. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah. They go in, and once this man gets in this old guy's house, and they're in there eating, the men of the city begin beating on the door, say, bring the man out so that we might know him carnally. You know, homosexuality running rampant there in that city. What happens is they actually take the man's concubine, and they rape and abuse her all night until she dies. A great wickedness. He says, this is what it's like. You're deeply corrupted, just like they were in Gibeah. All right. Well, we will pick up on Wednesday night. We'll pick up the last part of chapter 9 and see how far we can get. Appreciate all the comments. Excellent.
Got it, Tom, brother. Thanks, sir. You doing all right this morning? We're doing good. I'm
taking a nap.
Oh, there's a county, yeah. Rabbit. Oh, you're fine. Thank you.
Hey, Coach, if you're willing to risk it,
I don't mind.
where's the next picture?
You don't have to do that though, probably do it.
That's never been an issue for me.